Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d6. Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn g7 to g6. Knight b1 to c3. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn f2 to f4. Bishop f8 to g7. Knight g1 to f3. Pawn c7 to c5. Pawn d4 takes c5. Queen d8 to a5. Queen d1 to d4. Pawn d6 takes c5. Bishop f1 to b5, check. Bishop c8 to d7. Queen d4 takes c5. Castle kingside. Knight f3 to d2. Rook f8 to c8. Queen c5 to e5. Knight f6 to g4. Bishop b5 takes d7. Bishop g7 takes e5. Bishop d7 takes c8. Bishop e5 takes c3. Bishop c8 takes g4. Bishop c3 takes d2, check. Bishop c1 takes d2. Queen a5 to a4. Bishop g4 to f3. Queen a4 takes c2. Rook a1 to c1. Queen c2 to d3. Rook c1 to c8, check. King g8 to g7. Pawn a2 to a4. Pawn h7 to h6. Pawn a4 to a5. Knight b8 to c6. Rook c8 takes a8. Queen d3 to b1, check. Bishop f3 to d1. Queen b1 takes e4, check. King e1 to f2. Queen e4 to d4, check. Bishop d2 to e3. Queen d4 takes b2, check. Bishop d1 to e2. Knight c6 to d4. Rook h1 to e1. Knight d4 to c2. Bishop e2 to f3. Knight c2 takes e3, check. King f2 takes e3. Pawn e7 to e5. Rook e1 to d1. Queen b2 to c3, check. King e3 to f2. Queen c3 to c5, check. King f2 to g3. Queen c5 takes a5. Pawn f4 takes e5. Queen a5 takes e5, check. King g3 to f2. Queen e5 to c5, check. King f2 to e1. Pawn a7 to a5. Rook d1 to d7. Queen c5 to b4, check. King e1 to f2. Queen b4 to b2, check. King f2 to g3. Queen b2 to e5, check. King g3 to h3. Queen e5 to f4. Rook a8 to d8. Pawn h6 to h5. Rook d7 to d4. Queen f4 to e3. Rook d8 to d7. Queen e3 to e6, check. King h3 to g3. Pawn b7 to b5. Bishop f3 to e4. Pawn a5 to a4. King g3 to f3. Queen e6 to f6, check. King f3 to e3. Queen f6 to g5, check. King e3 to f3. Queen g5 to f6, check. King f3 to e3. Queen f6 to g5, check. King e3 to f3. Queen g5 to c1. Bishop e4 to d5. Queen c1 to f1, check. King f3 to e3. Queen f1 to g1, check. King e3 to d3. Queen g1 to d1, check. King d3 to c3. Queen d1 to a1, check. King c3 to d3. Queen a1 to d1, check. King d3 to c3. Queen d1 to a1, check. King c3 to d3. Queen a1 to d1, check. The game is a draw.